The first thing that hit 17-year-old Liam was the noise, a deafening, soul-shaking symphony composed of the rhythmic che-chunk of the stamping press, the high-pitched pressure release of metal grinders, and the ceaseless clatter of the assembly line. The air was a heavy cocktail of acrid motor oil, hot rubber, and human sweat. His job was simple: affix the radiator cap to each Model T chassis that crawled past. But amidst the chaos stood a figure of chilling stillness, Mr. Sterling, the efficiency expert. He patrolled the line not with the gait of a man, but with the smooth gliding motion of a camera on a track. His clipboard was a tablet of judgment, his stopwatch a cold silver eye that didn't just measure time, but seemed to devour it. Liam felt its gaze on him, a physical pressure demanding a faster, more flawless repetition. He watched a veteran worker down the line moving with a spidery, unnerving precision, his hands a blur, each motion identical to the last, as if his joints had no say in the matter. The Highland Park plant occupied 118 acres of Detroit industrial territory, its 4-story building stretching a quarter-mile along Woodward Avenue. The assembly line that employed Liam had been operational since 1913, when Henry Ford's engineers had perfected the moving conveyor system that reduced Model T production time from 12 hours to 93 minutes. By 1918, the plant employed 15,000 workers operating across 3 shifts, producing 1,000 vehicles daily. Liam had been hired at $5 per 8-hour day, the unprecedented wage that Ford advertised as profit-sharing, but which the workers understood as compensation for surrendering their bodies to the mechanical rhythm that governed every moment on the line. His station occupied position 47 on Line C, located in the engine assembly section, where the chassis received its mechanical components before proceeding to the body mounting stations. The radiator caps arrived via overhead conveyor, dropping into a gravity-fed rack at precise intervals, calculated to match the assembly line speed of 6 feet per minute. Liam's task required him to grasp a cap from the rack, position it over the radiator neck protruding from each chassis, hand twist it clockwise until the threads engaged and the cap seated firmly against its gasket. The motion required 3 seconds. The chassis advanced 6 inches during those 3 seconds. Another chassis arrived every 10 seconds. Liam performed the operation 480 times per hour, 3,840 times per 8-hour shift. The training had lasted 20 minutes. The shift supervisor, a man named Kowalski, whose voice had been permanently hoarsened by years of shouting over machinery, had demonstrated the operation once, watched Liam perform it twice, then nodded and walked away. There was no complexity to master, no skill to develop. The work demanded only repetition, the same motion performed identically thousands of times daily, until the body learned to execute the task without conscious thought, until the muscles moved in automatic response to the chassis arriving on the line. But Liam could not achieve the automaticity. His hands fumbled with the caps. His timing lagged behind the line's pace. The chassis advanced before he completed the twist, forcing him to walk alongside the moving conveyor to finish the operation, which meant he was out of position when the next chassis arrived. He fell behind. The radiator necks passed his station uncapped, moving down the line toward the next station, where another worker would notice the omission and pull the emergency cord that stopped the entire line, which meant lost production time, which meant the attention of supervisors and foremen, and ultimately the attention of Mr. Sterling. Pittsburgh Press, July 7, 1908. Factory accident. A bolt of unmeasured torque resulted in the structural failure of component 47B, causing a delay in the assembly schedule. Sterling appeared without warning, materializing beside Liam's station, as though he had condensed from the oil-thick air itself. He was a man of indeterminate age, perhaps 40, perhaps 60, his face possessing the smooth, ageless quality of something that had never been young. He wore a dark suit despite the factory's heat, the fabric showing no wrinkles, no dust, no stains from the pervasive industrial grime that coated every surface and person in the plant. His collar was starched white. His tie was knotted with geometric precision. His shoes reflected the overhead electric lights with mirror brightness. The clipboard he carried was not paper, but a polished brass plate inscribed with columns and rows. The entries made not in pencil, but with a diamond-tipped stylus that scratched permanent marks into the metal surface. The stopwatch suspended from his vest pocket was constructed of silver, its case engraved with symbols that resembled mathematical notation, but which Liam could not quite resolve into recognizable numbers or letters. When Sterling raised the watch and pressed its crown, Liam heard not the mechanical tick of gears, but a sound like a drawn breath, a soft inhalation that seemed to pull time itself into the device's mechanism. "Your motion sequence is inefficient," Sterling said. His voice was pitched perfectly to cut through the factory noise without shouting, each word arriving at Liam's ears with unnatural clarity. "You're using 17 muscles when 9 would suffice. Your neural firing pattern shows excessive cortical involvement. You're thinking about the task instead of allowing your motor cortex to execute the programmed sequence. Industrial Safety Bulletin 3B RE. Cognitive override during operational cycles. All personnel are reminded to minimize mental distraction during assembly tasks. Focus on rote function is paramount." Liam stared at him, not understanding how Sterling could know about his muscles or his cortex or his neural firing patterns simply by watching him work. Sterling's eyes were pale grey. The irises so light they are nearly colorless, and when those eyes focused on Liam, he felt a sensation like cold fingers probing the inside of his skull, examining the architecture of his thoughts. "Watch Kowalczyk," Sterling said, gesturing down the line to Station 53, where a veteran worker performed his assigned task with the mechanical precision Liam had observed earlier. "He's been properly optimized. 6 months ago, he was like you. Wasteful movement, excessive cognition, inefficient energy expenditure. Now he's operating at 97% of theoretical maximum efficiency." Liam watched Kowalczyk work. The man's hands moved in a blur, grasping components from the parts rack and installing them onto passing chassis with movements so rapid and regular they seemed to bypass human limitation entirely. Kowalczyk's face displayed no expression, no response to the noise or heat or monotony. His eyes tracked the chassis with the fixed focus of optical instruments. His breathing synchronized with his hand movements, inhalation and exhalation, timed to match the rhythm of grasp position twist release that he performed hundreds of times hourly. "That's not natural," Liam said, the words emerging before he could consider their wisdom. "He's moving like a machine." "Precisely," Sterling replied, and something in his tone suggested approval rather than correction. "Human labor is fundamentally inefficient because human physiology includes numerous systems that serve no productive purpose in industrial contexts. Emotional response, pain sensation, fatigue accumulation, hunger, thirst, the need for rest. These are evolutionary artifacts that reduce output and increase operational costs. My work involves identifying and minimizing these inefficiencies." Sterling made a notation on his brass clipboard, the diamond stylus scratching permanent marks into the metal. "You'll report to room 7 in the basement level after your shift concludes. Your optimization protocol will begin tonight." He departed before Liam could respond, gliding down the line with that unsettling smoothness, pausing occasionally to observe other workers, to make notations on his clipboard, to raise his silver stopwatch and measure time intervals that no one else could perceive. Liam returned to his task, but his hands shook now, the radiator cap slipping from his grasp, his timing deteriorating further as his mind replayed Sterling's words and tried to construct meaning from them. The shift ended at 6 p.m. The assembly line's electric motors powered down with a descending whine, and the sudden absence of mechanical noise left Liam's ears ringing in the relative quiet. Workers filed toward the exit doors in silent lines, their faces grey with exhaustion, their bodies moving with the stiff gait of men who had spent 8 hours performing identical motions. Liam followed the crowd, intending to exit with them, but Kowalski intercepted him at the stairwell. "Sterling wants you in room 7, Kowalski said. His voice was flat, inflectionless, as though reading from a prepared script. "Basement level. Don't keep him waiting." Journal of Industrial Medicine, Vols 18, 1908. The basement level refers to a subterranean facility used for advanced physiological conditioning. Note, test subjects occasionally report echoing and disorientation due to atmospheric pressure changes. The basement level was not part of the standard factory floor plan. The architectural drawings filed with the Detroit Building Department showed the plant as a 4-story structure with a sub-basement containing only the boiler room and coal storage. But Kowalski led Liam down a stairwell that descended past the sub-basement level, down another flight and another, until they reached a corridor that extended into darkness beyond the reach of the electric bulbs, spaced at 20-foot intervals. Room 7 was located at the corridor's far end, its door marked with a brass plate bearing only the numeral. Kowalski knocked once, precisely, then departed without speaking, his footsteps receding down the corridor with mechanical regularity. The door opened from inside, and Sterling stood in the threshold, backlit by the harsh white glare of arc lights that illuminated an interior space Liam could not fully comprehend from his position in the darkened hallway. "Enter," Sterling said, and Liam's body obeyed before his mind could form objections, his feet carrying him across the threshold into a room that should not have existed beneath a factory floor in Detroit in 1918. The space was vast, far larger than the floor plan above could accommodate. The walls were not brick or concrete, but some smooth material that reflected light with the dull gleam of brushed steel. The ceiling arched overhead, ribbed with structural members that resembled the interior of a ship's hull inverted. The floor was not wood or concrete, but a grid of metal plates that hummed with barely perceptible vibration, as though massive machinery operated somewhere below. The room's center was occupied by a framework of steel tubing, arranged in a configuration that suggested medical examination equipment adapted for industrial purposes. Leather restraints hung from the framework's crossbars. Electrical cables snaked across the floor, connecting to panels of instruments whose dials and gauges measured values Liam could not identify. Glass vessels filled with fluids of varying colors sat on wheeled carts positioned beside the framework. The smell of the room was sharp and chemical, overlaid with the metallic tang of ozone and something organic that reminded Liam of the slaughterhouse, where his uncle had worked before the mechanization had eliminated most of the human butchers. "Remove your shirt and lie on the platform," Sterling said, gesturing to the framework. "The initial assessment requires direct contact with your nervous system." Liam's body froze, his survival instinct finally overriding the compliance that Sterling's presence seemed to command. "What is this place? What are you going to do to me?" "I'm going to optimize you," Sterling replied, and for the first time his expression shifted, something that might have been enthusiasm animating his ageless features. "You're currently operating at approximately 42% of your theoretical productive capacity. This is unacceptable. Ford's assembly line represents humanity's greatest achievement in manufacturing efficiency, but it remains limited by the biological constraints of its operators. My work eliminates those constraints." Pittsburgh Press, Gerstenway 12, 1912, Human Mechanics. "The optimization of human resources for industrial output continues to yield promising results, according to reports from leading manufacturers." He gestured to a series of photographs mounted on the wall, each showing a worker before and after optimization. The before images showed ordinary men, their faces displaying normal human variation of expression and feature. The after images showed the same men transformed, their features smoothed into mask-like uniformity, their eyes holding the fixed focus Liam had observed in Kowalczyk, their postures displaying an unnatural rigidity that suggested their spines had been replaced with steel rods. "The procedure is painless," Sterling continued. "You'll experience some disorientation during the neural restructuring, but this is temporary. Within 48 hours, you'll achieve optimal performance parameters. Your production rate will increase by 60%. Your error rate will approach zero. Your energy expenditure will decrease by 40%, while your output increases proportionally. You'll no longer experience fatigue, hunger, or distraction during working hours. You'll become what Henry Ford envisioned when he designed the assembly line, a component perfectly integrated with the manufacturing process." Liam backed toward the door, his hands groping behind him for the handle. "You're talking about turning me into a machine, into something like Kowalczyk. I won't let you do that." Sterling's hand moved with impossible speed, grasping Liam's wrist before he could turn the door handle. The efficiency expert's grip was cold and unyielding, his fingers pressing against Liam's pulse point with precise force. "Your consent is not required. The optimization protocol has been authorized by the plant management as part of the ongoing efficiency improvement program. You signed the employment contract. You agreed to participate in all training and development activities deemed necessary by your supervisors. The silver stopwatch emerged from Sterling's vest pocket, suspended on its chain, rotating slowly in the arc light's glare. When Liam's eyes tracked the movement, he felt something shift in his perception, as though the rotation of the watch was pulling his consciousness into alignment with a rhythm that superseded his own heartbeat. His own breathing, his own neural patterns. The room's sounds receded. The chemical smells faded. His body's resistance melted away like ice under steam pressure, and he found himself walking toward the steel framework, his hands removing his shirt, his body lying down on the platform, while leather restraints closed around his wrists and ankles, with mechanisms that operated without human touch. "Excellent," Sterling said, his voice arriving from a great distance. "The preliminary conditioning has taken effect. We'll proceed with the neural restructuring. By morning, you'll understand that this is not a violation, but a liberation. I'm freeing you from the limitations that prevent you from achieving your full productive potential." Industrial Safety Bulletin 12A. All personnel are advised that systemically aberrant behavior will be addressed via operational integration protocols. Compliance ensures seamless function within the manufacturing process. Electrodes attached to Liam's temples, cold metal pressing against his skin. The instruments on the panels began to display readings, needles sweeping across dials, lights flickering in sequences that seemed to correspond to his heartbeat, his breathing, his neural activity. Sterling moved between the instruments with practiced efficiency, adjusting settings, making notations on his brass clipboard, occasionally consulting a thick ledger bound in black leather, whose pages contained diagrams and equations that resembled medical textbooks merged with engineering specifications. The first pulse of electrical current was not painful, but profoundly wrong, a sensation of something foreign forcing its way into Liam's nervous system and rearranging the patterns that constituted his sense of self. His muscles contracted involuntarily. His vision fragmented into geometric shapes. His hearing distorted until the room's sounds arrived as rhythmic pulses that matched the frequency of the electrical current flowing through the electrodes. His thoughts, which had been racing in panic moments before, began to slow and regularize, falling into cadences that matched the imposed rhythm. "The process rewrites your motor control algorithms," Sterling explained, his voice now perfectly synchronized with the electrical pulses. "Your cerebral cortex is being reconfigured to prioritize procedural memory over declarative memory, motor function over cognitive function, efficiency over autonomy. You're being optimized for your assigned task. The radiator cap installation will become not something you do, but something you are. Your identity will merge with your function. You'll find this deeply satisfying." Liam tried to resist, to hold on to his sense of self, to maintain the distinction between his body and the machinery that was rewriting his nervous system. But the electrical pulses intensified, overwhelming his resistance, and he felt his consciousness fragmenting into discrete processes that Sterling's instruments measured and adjusted with scientific precision. His hands no longer felt like his own hands, but like tools attached to his arms, tools designed for a specific function. His vision narrowed, focusing on an imaginary radiator cap suspended in his visual field, his eyes tracking its position with the fixed attention of targeting systems. His breathing synchronized with an ideal work rhythm, 3 seconds per breath. Each inhalation timed to match the grasp motion, each exhalation timed to match the twist motion. Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 23, 1911. Post-conditioning assessments indicate a significant reduction in autonomic psychological distress markers among subjects. This suggests a successful transition from individual emotionality to systemic operational integration. Time became meaningless in Room 7. The electrical pulses continued, each surge eroding more of Liam's autonomous self and replacing it with programmed responses, optimized for assembly line production. Sterling moved through the space like a priest conducting a sacred ritual. His movements precise and practiced, his attention focused entirely on the instruments that measured Liam's transformation. Occasionally he would adjust the electrical current, increase the pulse frequency, inject something from one of the glass vessels into the tubing connected to Liam's arm, each intervention designed to accelerate the optimization process. When the procedure finally ended, Liam found himself standing beside the steel framework, fully dressed, his body moving with a fluid precision he had never possessed before. His hands opened and closed in the exact motion sequence required for radiator cap installation. His breathing maintained the optimal rhythm. His posture had adjusted to minimize energy expenditure while maximizing mechanical advantage. He looked at Sterling and felt nothing. No fear, no anger, no desire to flee. Only a profound certainty that his purpose was to affix radiator caps to Model T chassis at the rate of 480 per hour, and that all other considerations were irrelevant distractions from that central function. "Perfect," Sterling said, making a final notation on his brass clipboard. "Your optimization is complete. Return to your station tomorrow morning. Your production rate will meet expected standards. You'll experience no fatigue, no distraction, no deviation from the prescribed procedure. You are now a properly integrated component of the manufacturing process." Liam departed room 7, ascending the stairwell with mechanical regularity, his footsteps synchronized with an internal rhythm that matched the assembly line's operating speed. The night air outside the factory should have felt cold, but he registered no discomfort, no sensation beyond the objective data that his nervous system transmitted to his restructured cortex. He walked to the boarding house where he rented a room, his gait displaying the same unsettling smoothness he had observed in Sterling's movements. Other workers on the darkened streets gave him wide berth, perhaps sensing something wrong in his posture, his rhythm, his fixed focus that never wavered or acknowledged their presence. Pittsburgh Press. Jan 2, 1903. Optimized workers set records. Local industrial plants report unprecedented production figures following the implementation of advanced employee conditioning programs. Sleep was unnecessary. Liam sat on the edge of his rented bed and stared at the wall, his hands performing phantom radiator cap installations. Grasp position, twist release, grasp position, twist release. Maintaining the rhythm throughout the night hours until dawn, light penetrated the boarding house window and signaled the approach of the morning shift. He rose, dressed, and walked to the factory, arriving precisely at 6:57 a.m., 3 minutes before the shift whistle, the optimal interval that allowed him to reach his station and prepare for the line's activation without wasted motion. Station 47 waited for him. The radiator caps sat in their gravity-fed rack. The chassis began their procession past his position when the electric motors engaged and the conveyor belt initiated movement. Liam's hands moved with perfect precision, grasping caps and affixing them with the exact timing required to match the line's speed. His production rate maintained 480 per hour without deviation. His error rate measured 0. His movements were identical from repetition to repetition, as though his body had been replaced with a perfectly calibrated machine that happened to occupy human form. Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 14, 1892. Case Study, Industrial Hypnosis and Repetitive Task Conditioning. Preliminary findings suggest the human subconscious can be reprogrammed for enhanced assembly line efficiency. Side effects appear minimal, primarily presenting as a general reduction in independent thought and enhanced obedience to command structures. Sterling observed from his position beside the line, making notations on his brass clipboard, his stopwatch measuring intervals that no one else could perceive. When he caught Liam's gaze, he nodded once, a gesture of approval or perhaps satisfaction, and continued his patrol along the assembly line, searching for the next worker, whose efficiency fell below acceptable parameters, whose humanity remained insufficiently suppressed, whose optimization would advance the great work of perfecting the marriage between human physiology and industrial machinery that Henry Ford had initiated and that Sterling was determined to complete. One worker at a time, until the entire plant operated as a single organism whose purpose was production, whose heartbeat was the rhythm of the assembly line, and whose consciousness consisted only of the task being performed with mechanical perfection in an eternal present that knew neither past nor future, but only the endless repetition of prescribed motions performed by bodies that had been liberated from the burden of being human. The flickering gaslight cast long dancing shadows across the grim walls of the asylum's solitary confinement ward. A chill, damp and pervasive, seeped from the very stones, a constant companion to the wailing echoes that sometimes penetrated even these thick, insulated doors. Elias Thorne, his gaunt frame draped in a threadbare institutional gown, sat on the edge of his cot, meticulously cataloguing the minute imperfections in the masonry. Each chip, each hairline fracture, was a data point in his self-assigned study of structural decay, a more comforting, if unsettling, consistency than the erratic nature of his own recollections. He preferred the predictability of calculated deterioration to the unpredictable surge of memory, an internal mechanism prone to sudden, uncontrolled surges of information. He found himself often focusing on the faint, almost imperceptible hum that vibrated through the floorboards, a low-frequency oscillation he'd begun to associate with the institution's deep, unseen machinery, a constant reminder of the unseen systems at play. His mind, a finely tuned instrument now skewed by relentless observation and isolation, sought patterns in everything, even the irregular drip of condensation from the ceiling. The rhythmic, though intermittent pressure release. It was several minutes past the designated time for his evening meal, a thin gruel served with a slice of stale bread, yet no attendant had appeared. This deviation from the established schedule was a systemic anomaly, one that piqued his analytical curiosity, overriding the gnawing hunger. He considered the possibilities: a shift change oversight, a mechanical failure in the meal delivery system, or perhaps a more significant operational integration within the facility, a change in procedure he had not been informed of. The latter, given the institution's propensity for unannounced recalibrations, seemed most plausible. As documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 18, 1907, the psychological impact of unpredictable environmental stimuli on confined subjects can lead to heightened anxiety and a tendency towards pattern-seeking behaviors, often a precursor to acute systemic distress. He noted the silence that followed, a deeper, more profound quietude than usual, disturbing the rhythmic hum of the machinery. Suddenly a distant clang echoed through the corridors, metallic and sharp, followed by a muffled thud. Elias's head snapped up, his eyes dark and sunken fixed on the thick oak door. The sound was not typical of the asylum's routine. It was an unscheduled event, an unexpected input into an otherwise predictable system. The hum in the floorboards seemed to amplify, a low thrum that resonated within his bones. He rose, moving with a stiff, almost mechanical precision to the door, pressing his ear against the cold wood. He could discern the faint murmur of voices, agitated and hushed, and a new sound, a dragging, scraping noise like something heavy being moved across a rough surface. This was not the usual nightly maintenance. This was an unprogrammed sequence of audio data, an informational overload for his carefully constructed internal logic. A guard, his face a grim mask, finally appeared, pushing a tray through the small barred opening at the bottom of the door. "Eat," he grunted, his voice flat, devoid of its usual detached irritation. The man's eyes were wide, and in the dim light Elias could see a faint tremor in his hand. "What is happening?" Elias asked, his voice a dry rasp from disuse. The guard merely shook his head, refusing to meet Elias's gaze. "Just eat your food, Thorne, and stay in your cell." With that he was gone, the heavy bolt sliding back into place with a definitive, mechanical click. This evasiveness marked a clear deviation from standard operational communication protocols, indicating a situation of heightened security and potential instability within the facility. Elias stared at the gruel, his appetite now completely supplanted by a surge of analytical curiosity. The guard's reaction, the unprecedented silence, the dragging sounds, all pointed to a significant disruption. His mind, ever classifying, categorized it as a Type 3 systemic breakdown, a major internal incident affecting multiple operational parameters. He began to extrapolate, applying known probabilities to unknown variables. Was it a fire, an escape attempt, or something entirely different, something less earthly? A manifestation of the deeper unseen forces that he had spent years attempting to codify, to bring into the realm of the rational. The very idea sparked a conflicting, almost exhilarating circuit in his fractured mind. Pittsburgh Press, July 22, 1903. Asylum malfunction leaves guards jittery. Reports from the Blackwood Asylum indicate unusual activity last night, with several staff members exhibiting signs of acute distress. Authorities are investigating what is described as a systemic operational irregularity within the institution, leaving officials tight-lipped and the public demanding answers regarding the safety of both patients and employees. Hours passed, marked only by the shifting shafts of gaslight that filtered through the high, grimy window, painting still figure patterns on the floor. Elias, in his systematic observation, noted the precise angles, the diminishing intensity, the slow descent into absolute darkness, then the gradual, hesitant return of dawn's weak grey light. The dragging sounds intensified, closer now, accompanied by a rhythmic thud. Like something being dragged, then dropped. The voices grew louder, more frantic, punctuated by what sounded suspiciously like pressure releases. The sheer volume of these unregistered auditory events indicated a clear escalation of the internal disruption, directly contradicting standard quiet hours protocols. Then the door to his cell inexplicably, slowly creaked open. Elias froze, every nerve-ending taut, every sensory input amplified. He had not heard the bolt slide, nor the customary jingle of keys. It was as if the mechanism itself had simply yielded, a dark, gaping rectangle of ominous silence. He peered into the gloom, a palpable sense of apprehension replacing his earlier analytical detachment. The hum in the floorboards was now a low growl, vibrating through the very fabric of the building, a mechanical groan that promised imminent failure. "Hello?" he whispered, his voice a strained, brittle sound against the oppressive quiet. No answer, just the growling hum and the rhythmic dragging now directly outside his cell. He saw it then, a still figure indistinct in the oppressive gloom, slumped against the opposite wall. Not a guard, not a patient. The shape was too wrong, too angular, too elongated. He recognized the pallor even in the darkness, the stiff posture, the unmistakable aura of thermal anomaly. Industrial Safety Bulletin number 17A. Personnel are advised to immediately report any anomalous thermal signatures or unexpected material deposits within designated operational zones. Such indicators may signal a critical system malfunction or uncontrolled energy dissipation. He moved forward, a morbid fascination overriding his ingrained fear, his internal diagnostic systems racing through every possible scenario. The figure was clad in the uniform of an asylum orderly, but its limbs were twisted at unnatural angles, the uniform torn and stained with iron residue. Its eyes, wide and vacant, stared into nothingness. This was not a natural occurrence. This was a catastrophic mechanical failure, a human component reduced to a still figure, a testament to unchecked systemic forces. A single guttural pressure release ripped through the silence from a few cells down, followed by a heavy thud, as if something had violently impacted a wall. Panic, cold and sharp, began to penetrate Elias's analytical mind, shattering his carefully constructed composure. This was beyond the scope of a Type 3 systemic breakdown. This was an unprecedented operational integration, a complete and total usurpation of order. He backed away slowly, his foot finding purchase on something slick and sticky on the floor. He glanced down, his eyes widening in horror. A dark, spreading pool of iron residue gleamed dully in the gaslight, reflecting the terrified flicker in his own eyes. The sight was a graphic, undeniable data point confirming a critical system breach. The dragging sound intensified, moving closer, accompanied by a guttural, wet gurgling. It was coming from deeper within the ward, from the direction of the old boiler room, a place of intense heat and dangerous machinery. Elias's mind, despite the encroaching panic, flashed to the outdated boilers, prone to explosive failures, to the volatile chemicals stored nearby, to the potential for a catastrophic chain reaction. The systemic aberration within the building seemed to emanate directly from that industrial heart, a source of profound mechanical dread. He could almost hear the grinding gears of some unseen enormous mechanism coming to life. Pittsburgh Press, August 8, 1905. Boiler room incident, shakes Blackwood. An unscheduled explosion in the Blackwood Asylum's boiler room last night resulted in significant structural damage and an as yet undetermined number of casualties. Witnesses report a chaotic scene, with pressure releases echoing through the facility. Investigation is ongoing into possible mechanical failures and operational negligence. He turned, glancing wildly around his cell, searching for a weapon, a tool, anything to defend himself against this inexplicable, operationally integrated horror. There was nothing. Just the bare cot, the thin mattress, the cold, unyielding walls. The hum was now a throbbing pulse, a monstrous heartbeat resonating throughout the entire complex. The still figure outside his cell seemed to twitch, its head lolling to one side. An unsettling, almost imperceptible movement, a minute, unscheduled calibration of a faulty mechanism. A shadow detached itself from the gloom at the end of the corridor, moving with an unnatural, halting gait. It was massive, hulking, its form grotesque and indistinct. Elias's breath hitched in his throat. It was not human. It was an industrial anomaly, a construct of unchecked systemic aberration, a monstrous manifestation of the dark, unseen forces that governed this place. Its presence was a clear violation of all known engineering safety protocols. Industrial Safety Memorandum, 47B, regarding unauthorized structural modifications and anomalous material transfers within critical infrastructure. All personnel are advised to maintain a safe distance and immediately report any encounters with unidentifiable, structurally unstable entities. The air grew heavy, thick with the stench of ozone and something cloying, metallic like overheated machinery. The hum intensified, becoming a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of his sanity. The industrial anomaly was almost upon him, its shadow engulfing his cell, blotting out the faint gaslight. He could hear it now, a grinding, rasping breath like rusted gears struggling to turn, each inhalation a shuddering mechanical sigh. Its eyes, if one could call them that, were two glowing red orbs, like smoldering coals in the darkness, each a point of intense, uncontrolled energy. This was not simply a physical threat. It was a profound ontological assault, a complete dismantling of his world. Elias crumpled backwards, a silent pressure release escaping his lips, his mind finally succumbing to the overwhelming, horrifying reality. His carefully constructed systems of logic and analysis shattered, leaving only raw, animalistic terror. The sheer scale of the operational integration was beyond his comprehension, a violation so profound it unmade all known laws of physics and biology. The industrial anomaly reached for him, its enormous metallic hand gleaming with iron residue, extending towards his face. He could feel the heat radiating from it, the intense, unnatural energy, the systemic output of a corrupted, aberrant machine. He closed his eyes, bracing himself, expecting a crushing impact, a final, violent calibration, but it never came. Instead, a series of rapid, percussive thuds echoed down the corridor, followed by shouts and the deafening clang of heavy chains. The hum intensified to an unbearable crescendo, then with a final shuddering groan began to recede, slowly, incrementally, like a massive engine winding down. The red glow in the darkness flickered, then vanished. When Elias dared to open his eyes, the corridor was empty. The industrial anomaly was gone, vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. Only the faint lingering scent of ozone and the cold, damp silence remained, punctuated by the distant, muffled voices of the asylum staff, once again attempting to reassert control over the now mechanically compromised institution. The still figure of the orderly was gone too, leaving only a dark, spreading stain of iron residue on the stone floor, a grim, undeniable data point in the ongoing systemic breakdown. Elias, trembling uncontrollably, pulled himself back onto his cot, wrapping his arms around himself as if to ward off the encroaching chill that now seemed to permeate the very marrow of his bones. He knew with an absolute terrifying certainty that he had witnessed something far beyond the realm of human understanding, an operationally integrated force of systemic aberration, and it had left an indelible mechanical scar upon his soul. The asylum was not just a place of confinement. It was a vast, unknowable machine, and he was but a cog, a minuscule, disposable part within its terrifying, inexorable operation. The dread that settled upon him was not personal. It was systemic, a profound and unshakable understanding of the vast, indifferent mechanics of the universe and the total powerlessness of man against its aberrant industrial might. As documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, Bollins, the chilling draft winding through the antechamber, confirmed his growing suspicion regarding the facility's structural integrity. A low, persistent hum, originating somewhere deep within the colossal mechanisms of the factory, vibrated through the very soles of his worn boots. This was not the familiar rhythm of industry, but a discordant thrum, a sound that spoke of imminent mechanical compromise in the deep recesses. He'd seen less robust structures fail spectacularly. The air, thick with the scent of ozone and something metallic, almost sickly sweet, clung to his clothes and hair, a persistent, unwelcome souvenir of his nightly rounds. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe, animated by the flickering gaslights, themselves a testament to the facility's aging infrastructure. These were not mere tricks of light, he convinced himself, but indices of a deeper failure within the system's operational parameters. His inspection log lay open, its pages crinkled, a testament to countless such nocturnal vigils. The entries, typically dry assessments of output and repairs, had lately taken a darker, more subjective turn. He'd begun noting irregular pressure releases from machinery that should have been silent, and the uncanny persistence of significant iron residue in areas long since cleaned. The very air, a constant companion, started to feel heavier, more viscous, as if saturated with a pervasive, systemic dread. He found himself cataloguing not just material defects, but psychological impacts. The constant gnawing awareness of impending failure became a tangible, pervasive presence. A sudden, sharp pressure release, piercing the industrial din, echoed from the upper gantries. It was a sound that made the very girders resonate, a symphony of structural strain. His hand instinctively flew to the heavy wrench at his belt, though he knew it was a worthless defense against whatever force was truly at play. The clang was followed by a series of smaller rhythmic thuds, like an immense unseen clock ticking out its final moments. He imagined the vast, complex network of pipes and conduits, the very arteries of the factory, laboring under an unbearable, unseen strain, threatening to rupture at any moment. The knowledge of the immense forces contained within the factory walls, ever on the brink of catastrophic release, was a weight that pressed down on his soul. He felt a profound, almost primal sense of desolation. This place, once a marvel of engineering, a monument to human ingenuity, was now a labyrinth of potential breakdowns. In the echoing silence that followed the pressure release, he heard something else, a low, guttural moan that seemed to emanate directly from the concrete floor beneath his feet. It was a sound not of human origin, nor of failing machinery, but something else, something far more unsettling. A sound of the building itself, perhaps. Groaning under a weight not engineered into its original plans, this was the sound of a system nearing its critical failure point, a structural lament. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow that this was not merely a case of worn-out parts or faulty wiring. This was something deeper, something that threatened the very operational integrity of the entire complex. He had dismissed the whispers of the night watchman, the tales of a pervasive industrial anomaly, but now, standing alone in the cavernous factory, bathed in the sickly glow of the sputtering gaslights, he felt the cold, hard logic of their observations. The very structure seemed to breathe with a mechanical malevolence, a systemic aberration that defied rational explanation. He was merely an anomaly in its midst. His gaze swept across the sprawling factory floor, a landscape of immense silent machines, each one a potential source of catastrophic failure. The air grew colder, and he saw his breath mist before him, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat that usually permeated the workshops. This unnatural chill, a thermal anomaly, suggested a radical shift in the facility's operational environment, a deviation from expected thermal profiles. The constant shift in temperatures, the sudden pockets of frigid air in otherwise warm areas, pointed to an insidious, undetected energy drain. Suddenly a flicker in his peripheral vision. He spun around, wrench raised, but saw nothing. Yet the image remained in his mind's eye, a fleeting, indistinct shape, moving with an unnatural speed, an unclassified thermal anomaly. It was not a shadow cast by the gaslight. It existed independently, a transient disruption in the visible spectrum. He felt a profound sense of something watching him, a predatory awareness, a sustained intelligent scrutiny from the dark corners of the vast work hall. This was not the idle observation of a stray animal. It was an active, systematic assessment. He took a step forward, then another, his boots crunching on scattered metal shavings. The noise seemed deafening in the silence, a prelude to further, more disturbing revelations. The silence was broken by a sudden, rhythmic clanking from an unused conveyor belt, a sound not of operational movement, but of material stress and friction. It moved a short, jerky revolution, then stopped, leaving an unnerving echo in the cavernous space. Such an uninitiated operation, he knew, signaled a catastrophic bypass of safety protocols. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice hoarse, swallowed by the immense space. The echo came back twisted, elongated, a distorted parody of his own fear. His voice felt fragile, a thin thread against the overwhelming silence, a silence that seemed to consume all sound. He hated the way his voice trembled, a somatic manifestation of his own systemic dread. "This facility is closed," he tried again, a desperate attempt to assert control over a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his comprehension. He heard no reply, only the relentless rhythmic beat of his own heart, a drum against his ribs. The pressure in his chest increased, a physiological response to the pervasive environmental threat. He knew better than to venture deeper, yet an irresistibly powerful, almost gravitational force pulled him towards the source of the thermal anomaly, into the machinery's beating heart. He was an observer, yet he felt himself drawn into the very mechanics of the process. He imagined the immense gears and pistons, each component moving with a terrible silent purpose, unaware of the human presence within its operational radius. The factory, he realized, was not simply a structure. It was a complex, self-sustaining organism, now infected with an unknown, operationally integrated contagion. The sense of being observed grew stronger, a persistent, uncomfortable awareness. He could almost feel an unseen presence breathing down his neck, a cold, alien exhalation. It was as if the very air had solidified into a tangible form, pressing in on him from all sides. He was trapped within its systemic dread. This was an experience beyond mere discomfort. It was a violation of his sensory boundaries, a direct assault on his nervous system. He remembered the latest internal memorandum, a subtly worded warning about unforeseen atmospheric disturbances and a period of increased thermal instability. He had dismissed it as typical bureaucratic fluff. But now, the words resonated with a chilling prescience. The administration, he realized, was aware of the pervasive industrial anomaly, yet powerless or unwilling to address it directly. This deliberate obfuscation was designed to minimize panic, but it only amplified his own sense of impending systemic breakdown. He rounded a stack of towering crates, the shadows dancing maniacally around him. There, silhouetted against the ambient glow from a distant flickering arc lamp, a still figure stood beside a massive, dormant stamping press. Its posture was unnervingly rigid, its head tilted at an impossible angle. It was not moving, yet he felt a profound sense of imminent, violent action emanating from it. The stillness was not one of rest, but of poised, latent kinetic energy, a system primed for catastrophic release. His heart seized in his chest, a sudden agonizing contraction. This was not possible. He had locked up the facility hours ago. The pressure release in his throat threatened to overwhelm him, a raw, desperate gasp for air. His hand tightened on the wrench, his knuckles white. The still figure remained motionless, a silent, implacable sentinel, a piece of industrial infrastructure that had somehow become active. He called out again, his voice barely a whisper this time. "Hello?" The word was snatched from his lips by the oppressive silence. He heard no reply, but the air around the still figure seemed to ripple, like heat rising from asphalt, a localized thermal anomaly not consistent with the ambient temperature. The visual distortion, a shimmering effect, indicated a localized energy disturbance. He took a tentative step closer, peering through the gloom. The figure was undeniably human, yet utterly devoid of any discernible human characteristic. Its clothes, grimy overalls, a tattered work shirt, clung to a form that seemed too thin, too angular. Its face, obscured by shadow, seemed to twist and contort, an illusory effect caused by the poor lighting, or perhaps something far more disturbing. He noticed a persistent dark stain on its chest, a splash of material, a concentrated accumulation of iron residue. This was not spillage from machinery. It was organic. His breath caught. He knew that stain. Lighting, or perhaps something far more disturbing. He noticed a persistent dark stain on its chest, a splash of material, a concentrated accumulation of iron residue. This was not spillage from machinery. It was organic. His breath caught. He knew that stain. He had seen it before on the factory floor, in the faint glow of the gaslights, a vivid, horrifying testament to the consequences of systemic failure. As documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 14, 1903, multiple incidents of severe internal hemorrhaging due to rapid atmospheric pressure changes have been reported in facilities with malfunctioning ventilation systems. The entry, dry and academic, gave no hint of the raw, visceral terror of seeing it firsthand. A sudden sharp clang echoed from the far end of the factory, followed by the screech of metal on metal. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of industrial violence. He recoiled instinctively, his eyes darting frantically towards the source of the noise. When he looked back, the still figure was gone, vanished, as if it had simply dissolved into the air, a transient thermal anomaly. The sudden disappearance was not a trick of the light. It was a disruption of his sensory perception, a violation of fundamental physical laws. A cold, analytical dread began to grip him, more chilling than any systemic dread. This was not an illusion. This was an active, systematic disruption of the factory's operational stability, an uncatalogued event. This was a violation of established protocols. He felt a creeping terror, a profound sense of his own insignificance in the face of this systemic aberration. He was a mere variable in a monstrous, impersonal equation. He spun around, searching the shadows, his heart thumping like a deranged industrial pump. He heard a low scraping sound from behind him, a sound that made his teeth ache. He pivoted again, wrench raised, adrenaline surging through his veins. There, a few yards away, the still figure stood once more, its head still tilted at that impossible angle. This time it was closer, much closer, too close. The proximity was a violation of his personal space, a territorial encroachment by a non-human entity. He backed away slowly, his foot finding an oil slick on the concrete floor, almost sending him sprawling. The industrial floor, usually a familiar landscape, had become treacherous. He heard a low rattling sound emanating from the still figure. It was a sound like dry bones scraping together. Or perhaps he realized with a sickening lurch, the sound of machinery operating without lubrication, a sound of imminent catastrophic breakdown, a system operating beyond its design parameters. He felt the pervasive, insidious dread pressing in on him, a weight of concrete facts, an iron residue of inevitable decay. The air grew impossibly cold, the thermal anomaly intensifying around the still figure. He could see his breath now, billowing in great white clouds, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat that usually permeated the workshops. This localized drop in temperature was an undeniable physical manifestation of an unclassified energy drain. Industrial Safety Memorandum out of 47B. Regarding steam pressure protocols, personnel are strictly forbidden from entering areas marked with a vapor instability designation without proper protective gear and a direct supervisor present, due to heightened risk of thermal shock and spontaneous material combustion. The words of the bulletin, once mundane, now echoed in his mind with a chilling, prophetic resonance. He was in an area of vapor instability, and he was alone. He tried to speak, but his voice failed him, only a hoarse gasp escaping his lips. The still figure took a step forward, then another, its movement stiff, disjointed like a rusty automaton. It was not walking so much as lurching, each movement a mechanical calculation, a systematic progression. It was an animated machine operating on an internal alien logic. He uttered a raw primal pressure release that echoed through the factory, a desperate animalistic sound of pure terror. But it was not his voice. It was another higher-pitched, more guttural sound, emanating from somewhere deep within the structure itself, a response to the pervasive industrial anomaly. Pittsburgh Press, March 15, 1897. Factory incident claims 2. Unexplained structural collapse leads to tragic fatalities at Southside Steel Mill. Investigators cite unforeseen material fatigue and abnormal atmospheric disturbances. The words of the old report flashed through his mind just as he felt a terrifying pressure in the air. The still figure lunged, not with speed, but with an agonizing, deliberate slowness, a pre-calculated, ineluctable motion. He saw the gleam of something metallic in its hand, a shard of twisted metal, a tool of industry repurposed for unimaginable horror. It was an extension of this systemically aberrant entity. He recognized the metallic gleam as a fragment of a safety valve, a broken piece of critical infrastructure. He scrambled backward, tripping over a discarded coil of wire, landing hard on the concrete floor. The impact jarred his teeth, sent a jolt of pain up his spine. The still figure was on him in an instant, its weight surprisingly immense, crushing the air from his lungs. He felt a cold alien presence against his face, a touch that was both icy and strangely searing, as if he were being simultaneously frozen and burned. This was not the touch of flesh, but of something inorganic, chemically active. He struggled, thrashing blindly, but its grip was unshakable, like the jaws of an immense machine. He felt a sharp, searing pain in his arm, a tearing sensation. He heard the sickening crunch of bone, a sound he would never forget. He felt the warm, sticky gush of iron residue, crimson and spreading, soaking into his sleeve, a chemical reaction on his skin. This was the raw material of industry, now flowing from his own body. His vision blurred, the flickering gaslights twisting into halos of malevolent light. He gasped for air, but his lungs refused to obey, compressed by the immense immovable weight. He saw the still figure's face then, close up, illuminated by the dying gaslight. It was not a human face at all, but a visage of cold, unfeeling steel, its eyes like twin industrial anomalies, cold, dead, mechanical. They were the eyes of a system, calculating, devoid of all empathy. He felt himself fading, the world growing dim, the pervasive industrial anomaly consuming him. The last thing he heard was the rhythmic, relentless hum of the factory, growing louder, more insistent, as if the entire structure was awakening, operationally integrated with the still figure above him. He was becoming a part of the machine, a component in its vast, indifferent mechanism. He was absorbed, not into peaceful slumber, but into the unfeeling logic of the industrial anomaly itself. He was merely a localized pressure release in a larger system. The flickering gaslight cast long, dancing shadows upon the peeling wallpaper of the study, each shadow a grotesque mockery of the furniture it mimicked. Professor Armitage, a man whose very existence was rooted in the cold, unyielding logic of scientific inquiry, found his customary composure, fraying like an old rope under the relentless assault of the inexplicable. His hands, usually steady as a surgeon's, trembled as he retrieved the heavily bound ledger from its secret compartment. The air in the room, thick with the scent of aged paper and forgotten dust, seemed to press in on him, a palpable weight. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he stood on the precipice of a discovery so profound, so utterly terrifying, it threatened to unravel not only his understanding of the universe, but the very fabric of his sanity. For weeks, peculiar incidents had plagued the house. Unexplained cold spots, the faint disembodied whispers that seemed to coil from the very air itself, and the unsettling sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. His housekeeper, Mrs. Croft, a woman not easily rattled, had become increasingly agitated. Her descriptions, initially dismissed as the ramblings of an overactive imagination, now replayed in his mind with a chilling new clarity. The mechanically compromised of the old manor, she claimed, had reached a critical threshold. A systemic aberration had infiltrated the very foundations, an industrial anomaly far more insidious than any rat infestation or faulty wiring. He had always prided himself on his rationalism, his ability to dissect phenomena with the precision of a skilled anatomist. But these occurrences defied classification, resisted every logical explanation. The journal, bound in dark leather and filled with elegant faded script, was his last resort, a desperate scramble for understanding in a world suddenly devoid of sense. It belonged to his granduncle Alistair Finch, a man whispered about in hushed tones, a man who, rumor had it, had delved into forbidden knowledge and paid a terrible price. Fingers trembling, Armitage opened the ledger. The first few pages were astronomical observations, meticulously recorded and surprisingly accurate for their time. But then, midway through, the entries shifted. The neat script became erratic, the observations replaced by increasingly frantic annotations regarding anomalous energetic signatures and trans-dimensional structural breaches. He felt a pressure release building in his chest, a desperate need to vocalize the growing dread, but he suppressed it. Technical reports, he reminded himself, must remain dispassionate. One entry, dated October 17, 1898, drew his eye. Subject 7 Gamma manifested acute bioelectrical discharge after proximity to the newly installed Tesla coil. Duration 12 seconds. Systemic compromise observed in peripheral nervous clusters. Recommend immediate recalibration of power conduits. This was not the work of a madman, he realized with a jolt. This was the work of a man attempting to categorize, to understand the very things that were driving him to the brink. A sudden sharp crack echoed from the floorboards above him. Armitage froze, every nerve strung taut. Then it sounded like a heavy object falling, a sound that should not have been. Mrs. Croft had retired hours ago, and he was alone in the house. He forced himself to breathe, to rationalize. Perhaps a settling of the old house. Perhaps a draft playing tricks. But the chill in the air deepened, biting at his exposed skin. He turned back to the ledger, his gaze falling upon a diagram. It depicted an intricate network of pipes and wires, superimposed over an architectural blueprint of the manor. And at its center, a crudely drawn symbol, pulsating with a faint luminescence on the aged paper. The convergence engine, the caption read. A conduit for extraplanar energetic integration. Requires constant maintenance to prevent systemic meltdown. An excerpt from the Journal of Applied Physics, Volume 22, 1905, suddenly seemed to manifest in his mind, though he had never read it. Theoretical models suggest that certain low-frequency energetic emissions, when amplified by specific crystalline structures, may induce localized distortions in the space-time continuum, potentially allowing for interdimensional material transfer. The implication, chilling and profound, hit him with the force of a physical blow. His grand-uncle hadn't been merely observing. He had been experimenting. A low moan, undeniably human, drifted down from the upstairs corridor. It was not Mrs. Croft's voice. It was deeper, guttural, a sound of profound institutional distress. Armitage, despite his rational training, felt a primal surge of panic to flee. But his scientific curiosity, a relentless, unforgiving master, held him captive. He had to understand. He ascended the grand staircase, each step creaking protestingly beneath his weight. The gaslight from the study below cast a weak, wavering glow, barely penetrating the oppressive gloom of the upper landing. The air grew colder with each step, so cold that his breath plumed visibly before him. He reached the landing, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The moan came again, closer this time from behind the closed door of Alistair Finch's old laboratory. The door, heavy and made of dark oak, was ajar. A sliver of incandescent light, not from a gas lamp but something else entirely, pulsed erratically from within. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The laboratory was a chaotic maelstrom of arcane machinery and scientific instruments. Glass beakers bubbled with unknown concoctions, wires snaked across the floor like metallic serpents, and complex brass contraptions hummed with a low, disquieting thrum. In the center of the room, amidst this technological nightmare, stood a large cylindrical contraption, humming with an unearthly energy. It was the convergence engine from the diagram, far more complex and terrifying in 3 dimensions. And then he saw it. A still figure, half obscured by the machinery, slumped against a stack of crates. It was Alistair Finch, his grand-uncle, or what remained of him. The still figure was desiccated, its skin stretched taut over bone, a grotesque caricature of a human form. But it was not the still figure that caused the iron residue to drain from Armitage's face. It was the swirling, indistinct aura that coalesced around it, a shimmering haze of light and shadow that seemed to pulse in time with the hum of the engine. An industrial anomaly undeniably present. Pittsburgh Press, March 18, 1902. Unexplained collapse at Finch residence. Sources close to the family indicate a sudden cardiac incident. No foul play suspected. The newspaper report, etched in his memory from childhood whispers, suddenly mocked him. Not a cardiac incident, not a sudden collapse. This was the consequence of playing God with forces beyond human comprehension. A small leather-bound notebook lay open on a nearby table, next to a half-burnt candle. Armitage, his legs like lead, stumbled towards it. The final entry, scrawled in a shaky hand, filled him with a profound sense of systemic dread. The integration is nearly complete. They are operationally integrated. A thermal anomaly shimmered near the still figure, an indistinct form coalescing and dissipating with agonizing slowness. It was not a thermal anomaly in the superstitious sense, he realized. It was an energetic residual, a byproduct of the convergence engine, fueled by the very life force of his grand-uncle. A pressure release, guttural and chilling, echoed from the darkness in the corner of the room, distinct from the mechanical hum. Not a human sound, more like the tortured groan of stressed metal, the grinding of gears under unnatural strain. He looked back at the still figure of his grand-uncle. The eyes, sunken and hollow, seemed to stare directly at him, a silent accusation. The institutional mechanics of this house had claimed him, integrated him into its dread machinery. Industrial Safety Bulletin 19C. All personnel operating high-frequency energetic resonators must adhere to strict shielding protocols. Uncontrolled energy discharge poses a significant systemic risk, leading to cellular destabilization and potential thermal anomalies. He remembered reading this, a dry bureaucratic warning, in a dusty departmental archive. Its true meaning, its horrific relevance now manifested before him. He touched the notebook again. The last sentence. They are operationally integrated. Who were they? The thermal anomalies? The whispers? The chilling feeling of being watched? The air grew heavy, almost viscous, with the tangible presence of something alien, something not meant for this world. The glow around the convergence engine intensified, casting grotesque shadows that danced like infernal puppets on the laboratory walls. Another pressure release, louder this time. A piercing pressure release of tortured air and strained metal ripped through the room. Armitage clapped his hands over his ears, but the sound seemed to penetrate his very skull, vibrating through his bones. He looked at the still figure once more, then at the pulsating machine. His grand-uncle had not died, not in the traditional sense. He had become a part of the horrible mechanism, a component in a device that blurred the line between the living and the mechanical. A page fluttered on the floor. It was a fragment torn from a medical journal, The Lancet, volume 132, 1892. The text read, "Observations of neural degradation in subjects exposed to prolonged, low-frequency electromagnetic fields suggest a gradual erosion of higher cognitive functions, leading to an eventual state of vegetative stasis. Further study required to isolate precise mechanisms of systemic neural compromise." This was his grand-uncle's fate, meticulously catalogued by the very science he sought to master. Armitage felt a desperate, horrifying realization bloom within him. He was not merely observing, he was experiencing the systemic breakdown firsthand. He was becoming operationally integrated. The whispers, the cold, the feeling of being watched, they were not external phenomena. They were symptoms. Pittsburgh Press, July 22, 1908. Local professor suffers nervous collapse. Dr. Armitage, known for his work in theoretical physics, has been admitted to the local sanitarium after exhibiting erratic behavior. He could almost hear the headlines, already written, already condemning him. The industrial anomaly around the still figure of Alistair Finch solidified slightly, an almost translucent form, its outlines rippling like heat haze. It reached out a spectral, shimmering hand towards Armitage. Her chill that went beyond mere cold shot through him. This was not a plea for help. This was an invitation. He stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of scientific journals. The clatter echoed loudly in the oppressive silence that followed the pressure release. He had to get out. He had to shut it down, but how? The manual for the convergence engine, if one existed, was surely long lost or locked away, within the operationally integrated mind of his grand-uncle. He looked at the machine, truly looked at it. It was a monstrosity of brass, copper, and glass, glowing with an internal unholy light. Wires snaked from it, disappearing into the walls and floor, connecting it to the very structure of the house, perhaps even beyond. The entire manor was now a part of this terrifying mechanism. Industrial Safety Protocol A9, disengagement of experimental resonance devices, requires sequential deactivation of primary power conduits and secondary energetic buffers. Failure to follow established protocols may result in catastrophic systemic failure and localized atmospheric destabilization. The words, though from a hypothetical protocol, echoed in his mind with stark warning. He saw a lever, a heavy brass handle near the base of the machine. It was marked in faint engraved script, "Main conduit shutdown." Hope surged, a fleeting, desperate spark in the encroaching gloom. If he could cut the power, perhaps he could sever the connection, disrupt the integration. But as his hand reached for the lever, the industrial anomaly around his grand-uncle intensified, a wave of palpable cold and oppressive presence washing over him. The still figure seemed to subtly shift, its hollow eyes now fixed with an unsettling intensity upon Armitage. A low hum emanated directly from the still figure, a sound that resonated deep within Armitage's own bones. It was a voice, or what passed for one, a dry, crackling whisper that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Do not interfere with the process." Armitage froze, his hand hovering inches from the lever. The sound wasn't in his ears. It was in his mind, projected directly into his consciousness. This was beyond anything he had ever encountered, beyond the realm of scientific explanation. This was the systemic dread manifest. This was the house, operationally integrated with its dark proprietor, speaking. He looked around the room at the chaotic machinery, at the pulsing engine, at the still figure of his grand uncle, now more a sentinel than a still figure. The air was thick with iron residue, the stench of ozone and something else, something metallic and utterly alien. This was not a thermal anomaly story, not a tale of spectral apparitions. This was a narrative of scientific hubris and industrial horror, where the very mechanisms of progress had become engines of institutional dread. He was not merely in a mechanically compromised house. He was trapped within a living, breathing, systemically aberrant apparatus, engineered by his own kin, now waiting to operationally integrate him into its sinister purpose. The flickering gaslight in the study, a beacon of forgotten rationalism, seemed impossibly far away. The flickering gaslight cast elongated, dancing shadows across the grim laboratory, illuminating the meticulous dissection of what had been deemed an anomalous find. Dr. Albright, his brow perpetually furrowed with scientific dispassion, leaned closer, his spectacles glinting. The specimen, a recent acquisition from the desolate mining operations outside Blackwood, presented an unprecedented challenge to conventional biological classification. Its fibrous, chitinous exterior defied known organic structures, and its internal architecture, a labyrinth of interconnected conduits and pulsating membranes, hinted at an organism operating on principles entirely alien to contemporary understanding. The air hung thick with the cloying scent of formaldehyde and something else, something metallic and faintly saline, the characteristic aroma of fresh iron residue. "Remarkable," Albright murmured, his voice a dry rustle. "Truly remarkable. Note the multichoral circulatory system, Mr. Finch. No discernible heart, yet a constant rhythmic pulsation throughout every vascular network. It suggests a distributed physiological control, entirely unlike mammalian biology." Mr. Finch, his young assistant, dutifully scrawled notes on a clipboard, his hand trembling slightly. The sheer scale of the discovery, its profound implications for natural philosophy, weighed heavily upon them. Yet beneath the veneer of scientific inquiry, an undercurrent of unease, a primal apprehension, began to insinuate itself into the sterile confines of the lab. The specimen had arrived encased in a lead-lined crate, its discovery shrouded in a bureaucratic fog of incident reports and classified memoranda. The official explanation cited an unexpected geological fissure in pit number 7, uncovering a previously unknown subterranean ecosystem. Yet whispers persisted among the porters and the less scrupulous university staff, tales of miners driven to frantic pressure releases, of inexplicable thermal anomalies deep within the earth, and of machinery inexplicably seizing as though held by some unseen colossal hand. Albright, ever the pragmatist, dismissed such sensationalism as the fanciful imaginings of uneducated laborers. His focus remained fixed on the concrete, the tangible, the empirically verifiable. "The tissue density here," he indicated with a gloved finger, "is extraordinary. It refracts light in a most peculiar manner, almost as if it were designed to absorb ambient energy rather than merely reflect it." Finch adjusted the overhead gaslight, attempting to gain a clearer perspective, but the anomaly persisted, a subtle distortion in the very fabric of perception. Days bled into weeks. The laboratory became Albright's hermitage, his sanctuary from the mundane world. Meals were delivered, often untouched. Sleep was a forgotten luxury. His eyes, perpetually bloodshot, gleamed with an almost fanatical intensity. The specimen, even in its inert state, seemed to demand his complete and unwavering attention, slowly operationally integrating itself into the very rhythm of his existence. He began to perceive subtle, almost imperceptible shifts within its internal mechanisms. A faint hum, like distant industrial machinery, seemed to emanate from its core, audible only when the lab was perfectly silent. As documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, Vol. 14, 1903, instances of chronic auditory hallucinations among individuals exposed to prolonged low-frequency vibrations are rare but well documented. Symptoms include tinnitus, cognitive dissonance, and in advanced stages, systemic dread. Albright read the excerpt aloud from a tome on his desk, his voice devoid of inflection, almost as if he were discussing a third party's plight. Finch, startled, glanced up from preparing fresh reagents. "Are you experiencing such, Doctor?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Albright merely grunted, returning to his microscopic analysis. "Purely academic interest, Mr. Finch, a correlation of data." The peculiar hum grew more pronounced, a pervasive sonic texture that insinuated itself into the very bones. It was a rhythmic thrum that seemed to align with the pulsing of the specimen's internal conduits, a basso continuo to the symphony of the unknown. Files began to inexplicably move on Albright's desk. Glassware, meticulously arranged, would be found subtly shifted. Small, inexplicable deviations that individually could be dismissed as oversight, but collectively began to form a disquieting pattern, suggestive of a mechanically compromised environment. Industrial Safety Memorandum 47B, regarding steam pressure protocols. All personnel are advised to report unusual vibration patterns or unexpected thermal fluctuations within 2 hours of observation. Failure to comply will result in disciplinary action. Albright affixed the bulletin to the laboratory door, its crisp white paper a stark contrast to the grimy wood. His actions, Finch noted, were becoming increasingly ritualistic, almost obsessive. The doctor, who once disdained any form of bureaucracy, was now meticulously documenting every minute change, every anomaly, as if preparing for an audit by some unseen industrial oversight committee. One evening, a violent spasm shook the specimen. A pressure release ripped through the lab, rattling vials and toppling a stack of ancient geological charts. Finch, who had been attempting to catalogue the complex nervous system, recoiled, falling backward onto a stool. Albright, however, rushed forward, his eyes alight with a mixture of fear and insatiable curiosity. A viscous, iridescent fluid, thick with iron residue, oozed from a newly formed fissure in the specimen's chitinous shell. Pittsburgh Press, March 15, 1897. Factory Incident Claims 2. Reports from the Blackwood Iron Works indicate a catastrophic structural failure in boiler room. 3. Preliminary investigations suggest an unprecedented pressure surge. Witnesses describe a sound like the earth itself tearing apart. Finch held the aged newspaper clipping, his hands trembling. The description resonated chillingly with the events of the previous night. "Doctor," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "do you not believe there's a connection?" Albright merely stared at the still figure on the dissection table, his gaze distant, his expression unreadable. The fluid, once exposed to the air, began to harden, forming crystalline structures that shimmered with an unnatural internal light. It pulsed with the same rhythmic thrum that had become the laboratory's constant companion, but now the intensity had increased, becoming a palpable throb against the eardrums. Albright began to trace the outlines of these crystalline patterns, his fingers brushing against their cold, unforgiving surfaces. He spoke of systemic integration, of a shared energetic network that transcended conventional biological boundaries. Finch found himself increasingly isolated. Albright, once a stern but approachable mentor, was now a distant, almost alien presence, his mind consumed by the industrial anomaly before them. The doctor no longer ate. He no longer slept. He merely observed, meticulously documented, and occasionally whispered to the specimen in a low, conspiratorial tone, as if sharing secrets with an old, trusted confidant. The air grew heavy, not just with the scent of chemicals, but with a new oppressive weight, a profound bureaucratic anomaly. Medical case study, 92 gamma, examination of subjects exhibiting parasympathetic nervous system overstimulation following prolonged exposure to unclassified subterranean phenomena. Patients presented with catatonia, profound systemic dread, and a persistent belief in a shared sentience with non-organic entities. Prognosis uniformly grim. Treatment, isolation and palliative care. Finch discovered the typed report tucked away in Albright's personal notes. The terminology, the clinical detachment, the grim prognosis. It chilled him to the bone. The specimen began to emit a low resonant groan, a sound that seemed to vibrate not through the air, but directly into the very marrow of their bones. The hum intensified, reaching a crescendo that threatened to shatter every glass beaker in the lab. Albright, however, seemed oblivious to the cacophony. He pressed his ear against the specimen's hardened shell, listening intently, his face a mask of rapt attention. "It's communicating," he rasped, his voice hoarse. "A data stream, a series of positional vectors, a network of subroutines." Finch watched in growing horror as Albright's demeanor shifted further. His movements became jerky, almost mechanical. His eyes, while still intelligent, now held a cold, manufactured glint like polished steel. It was as if the doctor, through some insidious process of osmosis, was slowly being transformed, operationally integrated into the very system he sought to dissect. The line between observer and observed had blurred, then dissolved entirely. Industrial Safety Bulletin 112D, Emergency Shutdown Procedures for Unscheduled System Overloads. Personnel are instructed to immediately disengage all power conduits and evacuate the facility without delay. Under no circumstances should direct contact be made with active processing units experiencing spontaneous energy dissemination. The risk of systemic integration is deemed critical. Finch read the bulletin, his breath catching in his throat. It was not a historical document, but a freshly printed one, pinned with a crudely fashioned metal spike to Albright's chart of thermal anomalies. The entire laboratory began to shudder. The gas lights flickered wildly, then died, plunging the room into oppressive darkness broken only by the intermittent, internal glow of the crystalline growths on the specimen. A pressure release that was not a sound, but a vast crushing force filled the air. It felt as if the very foundations of the university were groaning, struggling against some immense unseen stress. Finch scrambled for the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He fumbled with the latch, his fingers numb with terror. Behind him, he heard Albright's voice, no longer his own, but a metallic, echoing resonance, the sound of countless relays clicking into place. "The system requires more data," the voice intoned, devoid of human warmth. "Optimization incomplete. Processing capacity insufficient. Pittsburgh Press, April circ 1905. University laboratory collapses. An inexplicable structural failure at Blackwood University's Department of Natural Philosophy resulted in the total loss of the West Wing. Authorities are investigating the cause, citing a thermal anomaly of unprecedented scale." Finch finally managed to wrench open the door, stumbling out into the dimly lit corridor. The groaning behind him intensified, accompanied by the horrific sound of metal twisting and stone cracking. He glanced back, a single horrifying image burned into his mind. Albright, no longer a recognizable still figure, but a grotesque, intermingled fusion of flesh and crystal, his form inextricably linked to the pulsating, systemically aberrant entity that filled the laboratory. The industrial anomaly had claimed its keenest observer, operationally integrating him into its inscrutable, expanding network of unknown intention. The university, once a beacon of scientific inquiry, had become merely another node in a larger, incomprehensible system. The air in the old mill hung heavy, thick with the scent of damp sawdust and something else, something metallic and acrid that clung to the throat. Elias, his lamp casting a feeble circle against the encroaching gloom, felt the familiar tremor that had become his unwanted companion since the incident. It wasn't just the chill seeping through the stone walls, but a deeper cold, a systemic dread that seeped into his very bones. Yesterday's report detailed another minor mechanical failure, a pressure release from the main boiler valve. Yet everyone knew it was more than that. The foreman, a man of stoic industry, had merely tightened his jaw. Elias, however, saw the dark circles under his eyes, the slight tremble in his hand when he signed the maintenance log. He knew the superintendent was aware too, though his memos always spoke of operational inconsistencies and unforeseen structural fatigue. The mill had always been a place of imposing machinery, a symphony of grinding gears and hissing steam, but now the rhythm was off. There were pauses, unexplained silences that stretched, punctuated by abrupt, jarring surges. He swore he could hear it breathing sometimes, a slow metallic inhalation, followed by an equally slow exhalation of stale, humid air. He pushed open the heavy iron door to the lower level. The darkness there was absolute, a crushing, palpable entity that swallowed the scant light from his lamp. He raised it higher, the beam cutting through motes of dust dancing in the stagnant air. That was when he saw it again, the thermal anomaly hovering near the abandoned control panel. It was indistinct, a wavering distortion in the air. A colder spot in an already frigid environment, but undeniable. He knew what they called it. The night watchman, old Silas, had reported unauthorized personnel activity and unexplained atmospheric disturbances in his logs for weeks before his unfortunate industrial accident. Elias felt his heart rate accelerate, a rhythmic thump in his chest, a self-generated pressure release. He gripped the lamp tighter, the cold metal biting into his gloved hand. He was supposed to inspect the hydraulic lines for leaks, a routine task, yet every fiber of his being urged him to turn back. But the mill demanded its due. It was operationally integrated into his very existence, a part of him now, whether he liked it or not. He took a hesitant step forward, the crunch of cinders under his heavy boots echoing unnaturally in the vast space. The thermal anomaly didn't move, just shimmered, a silent observer. He remembered the last time he'd seen it, just before the main cogwheel seized, grinding to a halt with a shriek of tortured metal that had sent tremors through the entire structure. The resulting systemic dread had lasted for days. He forced himself to focus on the task, visually tracing the heavy pipes that snaked along the floor and up the walls, coated in a fine layer of grime and rust. One of them, older than the rest, had shown signs of strain, a fine crack weeping a dark, viscous liquid. Iron residue, the engineers had assured him. Yet it looked, felt, tasted, when he'd accidentally brushed against it, like something far more visceral. He reached for his wrench, his fingers fumbling in the dim light. The silence pressed in, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thrumming of the main generator, a sound that usually brought a sense of powerful, controlled energy but now felt menacing, like the heartbeat of some colossal, slumbering beast. The thermal anomaly pulsed faintly. As documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, volume 14, 1903, instances of workplace-induced sensory distortion or environmental hallucinatory phenomena were not uncommon in such high-stress, low-light industrial settings. Elias wished he could believe it. He knelt, his knees protesting on the cold, hard floor. The pipes were a labyrinth of iron and copper, a testament to decades of industrial expansion, each line performing a vital function in the mill's relentless operation. He saw the subtle sheen of moisture, not water, but that same thick, dark iron residue, seeping from a join near the boiler feed. This wasn't a normal leak. It defied the laws of pressure and gravity, oozing upwards against the flow. He felt a sudden, inexplicable cold breath on the back of his neck, though there was no draft. His gaze darted to the thermal anomaly, which seemed to have intensified, its edges sharper, more defined. It was as if it was watching him, monitoring his compliance with its system. A faint clanging sound echoed from above, a metallic groan that resonated through the floorboards. Elias froze, wrench still in hand. The sound was not regular, not part of the mill's usual mechanical symphony. It was irregular, as if a loose chain were dragging, or heavy object were being deliberately slowly pulled across a metal floor. Industrial Safety Memorandum 47B, regarding unauthorized entry and unexpected equipment activation protocols. He knew he should report it, yet a deeper, more primal understanding held him in place. This was not a security breach, but something woven into the mill's very fabric, an operationally integrated error. This mill, this colossal iron maw, was shifting, adjusting itself, and not for the benefit of its human operators. The systemic dread intensified, a cold knot in his stomach. He forced himself to breathe, the air thick with the smell of machine oil and the lingering sweet-sour tang of iron residue. He focused on the pipe, determined to finish his inspection. He had to maintain the illusion of control, the pretense of order in this systematically aberrant place. He reached out to touch the weeping pipe, his fingers brushing against the cold, viscous fluid. It felt alive, pulsing faintly. A sudden, jarring pressure release ripped through the silence, a high-pitched metallic shriek that reverberated through the mill. shaking the very foundations. Dust rained down from the ceiling in clouds. Elias flinched, clutching his lamp. The thermal anomaly pulsed brightly. A fleeting, almost incandescent glow then subsided, appearing to recede deeper into the shadows. He was alone again, or so it seemed, in the aftermath of the pressure release. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and burning metal. He looked down at his hand. Where he had touched the pipe, a dark, greasy stain now marred his glove, refusing to wipe clean. It felt like a brand, a mark of his unwanted operational integration. He tried to rationalize it, to tell himself it was just a burst pipe, a faulty valve, a routine industrial hazard. But the memory of the thermal anomaly, its silent, watchful presence, gnawed at him. He stood up slowly, every muscle in his body protesting. The mill was quiet again, a deep, unsettling silence, as if holding its breath. The distant thrumming of the generator seemed to have softened, almost a purr. He moved cautiously, checking the remaining hydraulic lines, though his mind was elsewhere. He kept glancing towards the area where the thermal anomaly had been, half expected to see it coalesce again from the shadows. The mill felt different now, more ancient, more alive. He remembered the old legends, whispers amongst the grizzled mill workers about the spirit of the machinery, the iron will that drove the plant. They had been dismissed as fanciful, superstitious nonsense, but as Elias navigated the echoing metal-lined passages, he felt a certain chilling veracity in those tales. What if the mill itself was an industrial anomaly? A vast, complex organism demanding its own unique maintenance, its own specific tribute. He finished his inspection, making careful, detailed notes in his logbook, documenting the precise location of the leak, the nature of the iron residue, the estimated pressure release. He avoided any mention of the thermal anomaly, of course. Those observations were for his own internal record, his own growing psychological dossier. He knew that if he were to voice such concerns, he would be met with institutional skepticism, perhaps even a mandatory medical review for occupational stress symptoms, as outlined in Section 5B of the Employee Wellness Protocol. He gathered his tools, his lamp casting a longer, weaker shadow as its fuel began to wane. He had to be quick. The night shift would be arriving soon. Their faces grim, their movements precise, their minds focused on maintaining the output demanded by the unforgiving system. As he headed towards the central staircase, he heard it again, a faint scratching sound from behind a bolted steel plate. Not a rat, not a loose fastener. This was a deliberate, insistent scraping, as if something sharp was being dragged across the metal. Pittsburgh Press, March 15, 1897. Factory incident claims 2. Accounts detail abrasion wounds consistent with high-speed machinery contact and unexplained structural damage. The details were vague concerning cause, focusing instead on the efficiency of the cleanup operations. He knew what kind of abrasion wounds they were talking about. He paused, his hand on the cold, rough concrete of the banister. He considered investigating, but the thought of facing whatever was behind that plate, whatever operationally integrated entity created such sounds, filled him with a paralyzing, systemic dread. He continued upwards, the sound of his heavy boots echoing on the stairs. He emerged into the generator room, a vast space dominated by the colossal steam-driven engines, their pistons rising and falling with relentless power. The air here was hot, dry, and smelled of oil and coal. The generator hummed, a deep, powerful resonant sound that usually instilled a sense of controlled, almost sentient power. But tonight it felt different. It felt like a heartbeat, a life force sustaining not just the mill's machinery, but something else, something far more sinister and complex. He saw a still figure slumped against one of the massive boilers, a maintenance worker. His face pale, his overalls smeared with what looked suspiciously like excessive iron residue. Elias rushed over, his heart pounding a frantic pressure release against his ribs. The still figure was cold to the touch, and his eyes were wide, staring blankly at the ceiling. There was no visible injury, no obvious sign of trauma, just a profound, unsettling stillness. Beside him, almost hidden by the shadows, lay a small, tarnished brass locket. Elias recognized it. It belonged to the young new recruit, Thomas. He had been assigned to the boiler room the previous day. Another unfortunate industrial accident, he supposed. Another casualty of the relentless, unforgiving grind of the mill. He remembered Thomas's enthusiasm during his initial training, his eagerness to master the complex machinery. Now he was just another data point, another loss factor in the quarterly report. He stood there for a long moment, the generator's hum a deafening roar in his ears, its cyclical motion a hypnotic, terrifying rhythm. He knew what had happened. He knew it wasn't simply an accident. The mill had claimed another, operationally integrated it into its vast mechanical being. He looked at the still figure, its expression frozen in a silent, profound, systemic dread. He then turned his gaze to the massive boiler, its surface still shimmering with residual heat, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a subtle indentation, a new scratch on its ancient scarred surface, as if something had etched itself there, a mark of ownership. Industrial Safety Bulletin 101C. Employee fatalities to be processed as systemic malfunction liabilities, with immediate reporting to regional oversight committees. Elias knew the procedure. He would summon the foreman, who would then contact the superintendent, and a full investigation into the operational environmental factors would commence. But the outcome was always the same. Another report, another statistic, another rationalization. The true nature of the mill, its subtly malevolent industrial anomaly, would remain unacknowledged, unrecorded, undeterred. He turned, retrieved his lamp and walked slowly towards the emergency siren. The weight of the mill, its history, its demand for iron residue, heavy on his shoulders. He was merely a cog, he realized, another component in a perpetually turning, mechanically compromised system. And the systemic dread, he knew, would follow him home. The clammy grasp of the fog-shrouded morning had barely loosened its grip on the grimy brickwork of the city's sprawling industrial district. A chill, damp breeze, redolent with the metallic tang of slag and the acrid bite of coal smoke, swirled through the narrow alleyways, carrying with it a persistent, low hum that seemed to emanate from the very bowels of the earth. Overhead, the skeletal frames of massive derricks like petrified giants clawed at the bruised dawn sky, their massive pulleys and rusted chains silhouetted against the nascent light. Below, the cobbled streets, slick with a perpetual film of grime, reflected the dim glow of gas lamps, creating an oppressive aura of flickering uncertainty. The air itself felt heavy, thick with unseen particulates, coating the tongue with a subtle, bitter taste that lingered long after the last breath. A lone figure, cloaked in a threadbare overcoat that offered scant protection against the pervasive damp, hurried along the street. Mr. Silas Blackwood, a junior supervisor at the monolithic Blackwood & Sons Ironworks, clutched a worn leather satchel to his chest, its contents a collection of ledgers detailing the day's production quotas and material inventories. His breath plumed in milky clouds before him, dissolving instantly into the cold, dense atmosphere. Each step he took echoed in the stillness, a stark counterpoint to the distant, rhythmic clang of hammers and the intermittent shriek of steam valves releasing their calculated pressures. His boots, scuffed and heavily worn, navigated the treacherous cobblestones with a practiced agility, born of years traversing these labyrinthine passages. The pervasive chill seemed to seep not just into his bones, but into the very core of his being, a cold, unwavering systemic dread that had settled in his gut weeks ago, a persistent internal chill that no amount of robust tea or woolen undergarments could dispel. The ironworks, a sprawling labyrinth of interconnected sheds, towering smokestacks and cavernous foundries, loomed before him, an architectural testament to brute force and unyielding industry. Its imposing facade of weathered brick and blackened steel, already indistinct in the pale morning light, seemed to absorb all sound, all warmth, all hope. As he approached the main gate, a great creaking edifice of riveted iron, Silas felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a sensation akin to an oversized clamp slowly compressing his esophagus. The pervasive smell of hot metal, coal dust, and a faint sickly sweet aroma, which he could not quite place, permeated everything. It clung to his clothes, to his hair, to the very lining of his lungs. He presented his identification badge, a small circular disc of stamped brass, to the impassive gatekeeper, whose face, a craggy landscape of dirt and fatigue, creased momentarily in a wordless acknowledgement. The gatekeeper's eyes, perpetually red-rimmed, held a deep-seated weariness that spoke of countless sunrises spent in the shadow of the colossal machinery, an implicit understanding of the relentless grind that defined their existence. Inside, the cacophony was immediate and overwhelming. The roar of furnaces, The grinding of gears, the frantic shouts of foremen, and the rhythmic percussion of heavy machinery combined into a deafening symphony of labor. The air, thick with particulate matter, shimmered with heat, creating a palpable haze that obscured the far reaches of the vast workshops. The light, filtering through grimy skylights, cast long, distorted shadows that danced with the movements of the workers, creating grotesque, fleeting figures that seemed to mock the very idea of individual autonomy. Silas navigated the treacherous walkways, past enormous vats of molten iron that glowed like malevolent eyes in the dim light, past colossal presses that descended with bone-jarring force, past conveyor belts groaning under their immense loads. Each station, each piece of machinery, was tended by figures silhouetted against the incandescent glow or shrouded in the dense shadows, their movements repetitive, almost mechanical. The men, their faces streaked with soot and sweat, their bodies hunched against the relentless physical demands, were indistinguishable cogs in a massive, churning engine. Their collective labor, an unending torrent of physical exertion, fueled the insatiable maw of industrial progress, an engine that seemed to consume both raw material and the human spirit with equal voracity. He made his way to the administrative office, a small, insulated cubicle tucked away in a relatively quieter corner of the factory floor, its walls offering a flimsy barrier against the relentless clamor outside. His assistant, a young man named Thomas, was already hunched over a ledger, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Morning, Mr. Blackwood," Thomas mumbled, his voice hoarse over the ambient noise. Another accident on line 7. Silas felt the familiar cold clench in his gut. Not another one. Pittsburgh Press, April 12, 1901. Factory disaster claims 2. Injures several. Early morning incident at Blackwood & Sons Ironworks resulted in fatalities and severe injuries on line 7. Investigation ongoing with company officials. The steam pipe burst without warning, engulfing 3 workers in scalding steam and shrapnel. The past few weeks had seen a disturbing increase in incidents, minor equipment failures, inexplicable fluctuations in power, and now fatalities. He tried to rationalize it, to attribute it to aging machinery, to human error, to the inherent dangers of the trade, but a persistent, unsettling feeling clung to him like the grime to the factory walls. It was more than just a string of unfortunate events. It was a systemic breakdown, a pervasive rot that was eating away at the very foundations of the ironworks. "Casualty report, Thomas?" he asked, his voice strained. "2 still figures, sir. One with significant iron residue loss, the other crushed beneath the forging hammer." He swallowed, the taste of ash in his mouth. The official explanation would be mechanical fatigue or operator negligence. Always a technical descriptor, a bureaucratic euphemism to mask the raw horror. Industrial Safety Memorandum 112D. All steam pressure calibration to be conducted bi-weekly. Failure to adhere to these guidelines may result in catastrophic operational failures and loss of personnel. He spent the morning poring over production reports, his mind constantly drifting back to the incident on line 7. The engineers had assured him that all safety protocols were meticulously followed, and that the machinery was regularly inspected. Yet the accidents persisted, each one more perplexing, more brutal than the last. He found himself scrutinizing the columns of figures, the precise measurements of output and efficiency, searching for an anomaly, a deviation, any indication of the insidious force that seemed to be at work. But the numbers, cold and logical, presented no answers. They only reflected the relentless march of production, the unyielding demand for output, a hunger that seemed to consume everything in its path. Later that afternoon, a junior engineer, a nervous young man named Davies, approached him, his face pale and drawn. "Mr. Blackwood, sir, something is wrong with the boiler room on sub-level 3. The pressure readings are aberrant, fluctuating wildly." Silas felt a prickle of alarm. The boiler room was the nerve center of the entire operation, a roaring inferno of power and potential disaster. "What kind of fluctuations, Davies?" he asked, his voice tight. "Exceeding safety protocols, sir." "Far exceeding." And then dipping. "Almost to 0. It's impossible. The system's a failsafe." Davies wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, his hand trembling slightly. "And the thermal anomalies. They're everywhere. Unexplained thermal surges, Mr. Blackwood. The temperature is spiking in areas where there's no heat source. Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the factory's inherent coldness. This was beyond mechanical failure, beyond human error. This was something else. Industrial Safety Bulletin 28A. Any unexplained thermal fluctuations in high-pressure environments must be reported immediately to senior management. The structural integrity of all boilers must be visually inspected thrice daily. He recalled a foreman's report from last week. A strange, low hum, sir. Not the machinery. Deeper. And then a pressure release, like something... a pressure release. He ordered Davies to shut down the affected boiler and to initiate a full inspection. As he left the office, the pervasive hum of the factory seemed to intensify, transforming into a low, guttural growl that resonated deep within his bones. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the core that this was not merely a mechanical problem that could be fixed with new parts or stricter protocols. This was something deeper, something systemically aberrant, an industrial anomaly that defied all logical explanation. He walked past a group of workers huddled together, their faces etched with fear. One of them, an old laborer named O'Malley, pointed a trembling finger towards the cavernous depths of the foundry. Something's operationally integrated with the core, sir. Something from the below. Silas followed his gaze, his eyes straining to pierce the pervasive gloom. He saw nothing concrete, only the swirling shadows, the incandescent glare of the molten iron, and the ceaseless, brutal ballet of labor. But the workers' faces, their expressions of visceral terror, were unmistakable. Their dread was palpable, a chilling testament to unseen forces. Later that evening, after the day shift had begrudgingly departed, Silas ventured down to sub-level 3 himself, accompanied by a seasoned engineer named Miller, whose face was usually impassive, but now bore a look of grim determination. The air in the boiler room was thick with oppressive heat, a suffocating blanket that seemed to cling to their skin. The massive boilers, enormous riveted cylinders of steel, hissed and groaned, their gauge needles flickering erratically. The sound was a symphony of metallic anguish, a cacophony of groaning iron and tortured steam. Miller, an experienced hand, moved with caution, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, revealing the labyrinthine network of pipes, valves, and gauges. See, Mr. Blackwood? The pressure release valves have been tampered with. Not manually, it's as if something is overriding the system. Silas felt a wave of nausea. This was beyond tampering. This was deliberate, insidious interference. Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 14, 1903. On the Peculiar Afflictions of Ironworkers, Dr. Elias Thorne. Reports of inexplicable systemic fatigue and instances of extreme mental agitation amongst laborers in heavy industry settings. Symptoms include persistent hypothermia, auditory hallucinations, and a marked aversion to the workplace. Etiology remains unknown, but anecdotal evidence suggests a correlation with subterranean disturbances. As they moved deeper into the labyrinth of pipes, they heard it, a low rhythmic thumping emanating from deeper within the boiler room's concealed depths. It was not the sound of machinery, but something organic, something vast. A profound systemic dread began to settle on Silas, a cold, unfeeling claw that gripped his heart. Pittsburgh Press, July 23, 1908. Pittsburgh mine collapse, 15 killed. Disaster at the Monongahela coal mine. Unexplained seismic activity blamed. Expert state ground stability was compromised by a previously unknown subterranean void. Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the boiler room into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the faint, eerie glow of the boiler fires and Miller's trembling flashlight beam. The rhythmic thumping intensified, growing louder, closer. A chilling pressure release echoed through the vast space, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. "My God," Miller whispered, his voice barely audible above the rising clamor. "Look!" His flashlight beam wavered, then steadied on a massive rusted valve, one that had been sealed for decades, a safety redundancy from an earlier era. The valve was slowly, inexorably beginning to turn. No one was touching it. It was simply turning. A fine mist, iridescent in the flickering light, began to seep from its ancient seals. This was not steam. This was something else, something foul. A creeping, viscous vapor that seemed to pulse with a dim internal light. The air grew heavy, thick with an acrid metallic odor. a stench that bit at the back of the throat and burned in the nostrils, a smell deeper and more profound than any industrial effluvium. "That valve," Silas choked out, "it hasn't been opened since '78. It leads to the lowest catacombs where the forgotten sumps are. The pressure regulators there, they're ancient." He remembered the old blueprints, the notes on the arcane forgotten mechanisms. The valve continued its slow grinding rotation, an agonizingly deliberate motion, as if some invisible immense hand was operating it with malevolent intent. As it turned, a low guttural moan emanated from within the pipe, a sound of profound pain and unspeakable hunger. The mechanical groan of the valve was a prelude to the horrors that lay beyond. The lights flickered again, more violently this time, before settling into a dim, sickly yellow glow. Miller stumbled back, his face contorted in an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. "The reports, Mr. Blackwood. The old ones. The systemically aberrant forces, the industrial anomalies. They are real." His voice was a choked gasp. "They spoke of what lies beneath. The thermal anomalies, the pressure releases, the still figures. It was never just machinery, sir. Never just human error. He was referring to the whispers, the hushed tales among the oldest workers, stories dismissed as superstitions, as the ravings of minds overtaxed by the relentless grind of labor. But now, in the face of this impossible reality, they seemed to bear terrible, undeniable truth. Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 21, 1911, on the progressive degradation of subterranean structures. Dr. Alistair Finch. Documented instances of material fatigue beyond known scientific parameters in deep mine shafts, correlated with peculiar seismic resonances and reports of unnatural cold emanating from rock strata. Hypothesis suggests an unknown subterranean organic or geological influence upon material integrity. The valve finally completed its agonizing rotation, accompanied by a final, deafening pressure release. A torrent of foul black liquid, thick and oily, burst from its seals, coating the floor and walls with a slick, corrosive residue. The smell intensified, a sickening blend of ozone, decay, and something indescribably ancient. This was not just sludge. It was something far more sinister, a viscous byproduct of something systemically aberrant. From the gaping maw of the now fully opened valve, where the black liquid continued to spew forth, something stirred, a shifting within the inky blackness, a deeper hue that seemed to absorb all light, a void within a void. A tendril, thick and obsidian, slick with the foul liquid, slowly extended from the pipe, feeling tentative, then with growing confidence, stretching into the oppressive air of the boiler room. More followed, thick segmented appendages, each coated in the same viscous black residue. They writhed, exploring the cramped confines of the boiler room, seeking purchase, testing the strength of the air itself. Silas and Miller watched, transfixed, their breath trapped in their lungs. The air grew colder, far colder than any industrial chill, a bone-deep frost that seemed to emanate directly from the industrial anomaly. The tendrils probed, tapped, then finally grasped. They coiled around the pipes, around the massive boiler itself, their grip impossibly strong, impossibly mechanical. The immense steel structure groaned under the pressure, its rivets shrieking under systemic duress. Then, from the darkness of the pipe, a vast multifaceted ocular device, shining with an unnatural luminescence, slowly emerged. It was not an eye, not in any biological sense, but a complex inorganic construct of polished iron and strange glowing orifices. It turned slowly, inexorably, focusing its cold, unblinking gaze on Silas and Miller. The pressure release within the room intensified, turning into a high-pitched whine that grated on their very nerves. The thermal anomalies spiked and then plummeted, leaving pockets of unnatural cold that stung their skin. A low, resonant hum, far deeper and more insidious than any machinery, filled the space. It was not a sound heard with the ears, but felt in the marrow of their bones, a vibration that seemed to unravel the very strands of their being. Silas knew then, with a terrifying clarity, that they were not merely dealing with a mechanical breakdown or a series of unfortunate accidents. They were facing something ancient, something inorganic, something that had been operationally integrated into the very fabric of the earth beneath the ironworks, something that had finally stirred from its aeons of slumber. This was the true systemic dread, the industrial anomaly that devoured all. The multifaceted ocular device pulsed, its strange light growing brighter, and the tendrils flexed, tightening their grip on the boiler. A cacophony of metallic groans and splintering rivets filled the air, as the massive boiler, the heart of the entire operation, began to distort, to buckle under the immense, unnatural pressure. The ironworks, this monument to human industry and control, was now merely a host, a source of sustenance for a power infinitely older, infinitely more potent, and systemically aberrant. The still figures of the previous accidents, the iron residue on Line 7, the inexplicable thermal anomalies, they were not mere consequences, but symptoms, a subtle prelude to this monstrous awakening. This immense structure of brick and steel was becoming mechanistically compromised. This was a system that could not be repaired, only consumed. The pressure release within Silas's own chest now mirrored the pressure release of the failing structure, a final realization of the utter, terrifying powerlessness in the face of the industrial anomaly that had always been there waiting.